I think that one of the great delusions foisted on the American people through sometimes I call it the Trump industrial complex, but a lot of uh, through a lot of the news media is this idea that the conflict, the partisanship is normal and reflective of reality.
Mm,
Do you find it to be, or do you find it to be illusory? I mean, for example, I appreciate that some people lose it completely on airplanes. And I've been hoping to see one of them, right, as a frequent flyer for some time, right, in the way that people see grizzly bears, right, in Yellowstone, right. I've wanted to see a Karen attack, right, in the wild,
mm,
live. Um, but I haven't, right. And in fact, right, though I read about and my algorithm feeds me a lot of stories about a lot of craziness and a lot of insanity, my lived experience does not compute with that, where I find most people to be civil, polite, normal, not at each other's throats. And so how do we reconcile these two things in the moment through a historical context? Or, right, do you think about it? We're just in this completely new era, bound together through mediums where every fringe point of view is instantly amplified, circulated at a velocity that the truth can never hope to keep up with. And therefore, right, the liar with the biggest bullhorn is ultimately destined to prevail in any type of conversation in the public square concerning the public interest. I mean, how do you kind of sort through this era against what it is that you're trying to do? Politics to me is downrange of culture, right? And the big mistake is that so many cover it as if it creates culture. So where are we in the culture right now, historically against other periods in the country as you see it? Like anything that inspires you, worries you more?
mm. That's a great question. It is a great question that I think a lot of people are still sorting through because our technology to be able to talk to each other, our technology to be able to make information go viral is so new in relationship to human history. Right. So, of course, social media is very new in the broad scope of human history. And so, what actually will happen is still a bit TBD. And anybody who claims to have the answers of, like, here's what's going to happen, it's going to lead to the following 12 terrible things, the demise of humanity, or it's going to be the great uplift and we're all going to be better for it. I think all that is prognostication. We can't know these things yet. But what we do know is that we have an important role in shaping that outcome. It's our job to help shape that outcome rather than viewing ourselves as helpless participants who have no ability to change what might happen in the future. So, in terms of where we are in comparison to historic context, of course, portions of where we are, like our technological development, has never there's nothing to compare it to. Like you can compare it to the printing press or, there's things you can try to extrapolate, but it's none of it is a one-to-one. That said, is this the worst it has ever been in human history? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's not the worst it's been in the United States. It's not the worst that has been around the world. We have been far worse off than we are today. There was a time period in the mid 19th century in which violence inside the United States Congress was so prevalent that people were beaten within an inch of their lives, and had to leave Congress for multiple years because their injuries were so severe inside the United States Capitol, one senator against a representative. That person who engaged in beating the other member of Congress was investigated, and then Congress decided not to censure the person who beat the other person within an inch of their life. And then rather than deal with any consequences, that person decided to quit Congress, but then ran for re-election and got reelected. Okay, so there have been times, that's just one example of times where people, I mean, guns have been fired inside the United States Capitol. That is just one example of how times have changed for the better in many ways. And by the way, what they were fighting over was the right to enslave people. And so, has anybody been beaten within an inch of their life inside the US Capitol over in a fight over whether or not it is acceptable to own human beings this week? No. So, by those types of measures, we are better off than we have been in the past. Obviously, the Civil War is a case study for what happens when we have extreme factionalism and tribalism. Hundreds of thousands of people, somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 people died because of that excess factionalism and tribalism. So that's one of the things that I see is a speeding train on this excessive factionalism and tribalism. Now, I'm not saying civil war is imminent. I'm not saying doom is at hand. What I am saying is that we have had moments in our history before in which our baser instincts, our default tribal settings, led us to the brink of disaster. And it just so happened that the Union held. And it just so happened that the North was better equipped than the South. But it could have turned out differently. And so consequently, those are chances that I'm not interested in taking. Those are risks that I'm not interested in participating in. So that's what I say. That's what I mean when I say we have an important role to play in the outcome. If we're just waiting for government officials to figure it out, well, I've just laid out the case of why Congress is quite ineffective, right? If we're waiting for them to figure it out, that's bad news. Some members of Congress who are in charge of doing things like regulating technology have hearings in which they call up tech CEOs and then they ask them questions like, is TikTok Wi-Fi? They don't understand the difference between TikTok and Wi-Fi. They thought TikTok was Wi-Fi. And that's kind of a laughable example. I mean, it's a true example, but it's kind of an example of like, this is to your point, these are not the people who are shaping culture. Right? Like these are the people who actually are getting paid by taxpayers who should avail themselves of the education that's readily available to distinguish between important things like should we be regulating social media and what actually is Wi-Fi. I guarantee they have a 22-year-old staffer working in their office who could help them sort these things out. And the fact that they don't says a lot about them. These are the people in charge of regulating important things in the United States. So I agree with you that politics is downwind of culture, but I do think that our political discourse can and does impact culture in some ways, and in many ways, it is has not been a positive impact recently.